Recent events have led to public demonstrations, and some property has sustained damage or been destroyed.
Looters smashed their way into the store. They set fires, and now we're hearing at least 200 people were arrested.
So now I want to talk about it. On the surface, I can understand why the concept of property is something that we hold close and personal. Our things, our stuff, our junk, these things belong to us, and we assign a part of our identity to the things that we own. This attachment is so significant that we look at our things as an extension of our physical being. We have not just a responsibility to protect our property, we have a right. We have property rights. Except that most of what I just said extends far beyond reason. We expand the concept of property rights to include material needs at the expense of others. We use it to exercise significant levels of social control and turn property into a currency of sorts that puts power into the hands of the people holding the property. Oftentimes, when using the term property, we tend to be talking about buildings, residences, businesses. When we say that somebody owns property, we usually mean that they own land with a structure on it. These structures can have a lot of uses, but the most common usage is housing. Now, one can see why we'd be very possessive and protective of the concept of property when it comes to housing. We see housing as home. We see it as a place where we live, a place where we're safe. We make memories there with family and friends. We cook meals, we eat, we sleep, we raise children and dogs. The truth is that people in society with the most power and influence don't see property or housing in this fashion. 37% of households are renting their home. This means that 37% of households are residing in a property that legally does not belong to them and exists purely for the profit motive of the owner. 74% of the rental properties in this country are owned by individual investors. So while I'd like to make this a problem of evil corporations, the fact of the matter is that this is a system that allows people to own and sell a human need for the sake of profit. There is also a sizable chunk of the population, something to the tune of 6 million people, who are housing insecure. In other words, on any given day, they may not know where they are going to sleep that night. So the legal institutions reinforce this right that these property owners have to their property, especially when it comes to kicking people out due to financial hardship. When one of those who are renting their house are no longer able to monetize their labor to fill the bank account of their landlord, the landlord gets to exercise their rights to the property and make their residents homeless. Why do we never question the right to own and commodify shelter, but we balk at the idea of making shelter a human right? Multiple studies have shown that it would be better for the mental and physical health of the homeless if we just gave them homes first, and then began addressing concerns such as employment, addiction, and mental illness. Oh, and for those of you who need to hear why it's cheaper to give homeless people homes, do you bend over and jerk it into your wallet daily, or do you just pull up your bank account on your computer screen and spank it real quick? You think there's a Rule 34 about this? Yeah, so experts have said that it would be less of a drain on the taxpayers to subsidize the housing for the homeless, as opposed to subsidizing their future hospital bills that come about as a result of sleeping on the ground, or future law enforcement expenses whenever those who swore an oath to protect and serve are sent to go bust up encampments and further kick down at our most vulnerable members of society. And why does this keep happening? Why do we support this? Something must be done. Housing the homeless at taxpayer expense would be cheaper than our current system. And yet, 6 million people go to bed without a roof over their heads every night, while 16 million homes currently sit empty in this country. Most of those homes aren't even owned by landlords or rental companies. They sit in the hands of banks and speculative investors, waiting for the markets to shift so they can sell them. The only reason we can't just give these homes to people that need them is that it is potentially more profitable for these homes to sit empty than to just relinquish them for the public good. Recent events have led to the unemployment rate reaching 20%, and if people aren't even able to afford food, then they certainly can't afford rent. Other countries, in response to the ongoing pandemic, issued rent holidays and loan payment forgiveness at a national scale, or provided no strings attached monthly stimuli so that the majority of the population could afford to stay safe at home and weather the outbreak. But of course, that goes against the American philosophy of giving property rights priority above all else. In the years prior to the pandemic, the discussion was centered around immigrants and refugees, whether we have a responsibility as a nation to provide asylum to refugees, the necessity of building a physical wall on the border, and the moral implications of locking children in cages, all for the crime of crossing a line in the sand. You've probably even heard some of these common phrases from some of the worst people you know, like, well, your house has walls, or how would you feel if some people just came into your house and said they had a right to be there? Yeah. And have you ever thought about how weird and incredibly entitled someone would have to be to equate the entirety of the continental United States with the personal property that you or I live on? Like, you understand that other people live on this planet. This doesn't even begin to cover how inconsistent the application of property rights have been to minority groups since the founding of this nation. To this day, Native Americans have to constantly fight for some semblance of autonomy over their ancestral lands. In 1921, white mobs didn't care a whole lot about the property rights of an entire affluent black neighborhood in Tulsa. They burned it to the ground, and no reparations have been made. Heck, up until the 1970s, there were still large parts of the country where you could refuse to serve black patrons because it was your property, your right. This argument has resurfaced, except that now it is about gender. Most Western libertarians will tell you that property rights also include one's physical self, yet still oppose the bodily autonomy of women or the right to gender confirmation for transgender persons. So we absolutely cannot ignore the historically racist, classist, and sexist underpinnings of this concept of property rights. Property rights have only ever been a constant for the ruling class, and just like in feudalism, in mercantilism, and now in neoliberal capitalism, the ruling class gets to decide what is property and who owns it. We've twisted this concept of property rights to not just extend to the personal property that we own and use, like your toothbrush, your guns, your car, but expanded it to include commodified amenities that are necessities for survival in the developed world. And this isn't by accident. This is by design. Neoliberal capitalism demands it. Think about it. Why can't Americans just be given the medication that they need? If someone needs the medication to live and they can't afford it, but we oppose providing this medication free of out-of-pocket expense, we are basically saying that we value our tax dollars over the lives of fellow Americans. In the wealthiest country on earth, we have people who die of starvation, die needing medication, die of exposure, die of a virus because they can't lose their job, and have cops point firearms into a car with children in it because of stolen property. We have several states that defend the right to gun down 2 teenagers for walking into your garage. Sorry, castle. All because of property. This isn't normal thinking. This is a death cult mindset. So you can excuse me for not really caring a whole lot about damage to property. The worship of property rights is very much America's property, and I think it's about time we damage this concept, if not destroy it outright.